Greetings. In this video, we will combine three separate scene files into a single scene file that we can render and submit for your final project. Let's start by preparing each of those three files for import. For our robot walk cycle, right, he still walks and then comes to a stop. When you're importing a rigged character, oftentimes the character is the wrong size or facing in the wrong direction. We can create a transform node for a rig and then reposition, reorient that, and scale, of course, that rig. For this guy, if you had some lights in here or some additional, maybe a ground plane you created, you can get rid of all of that. And let's just review. Here is our entire chain with all of the geometry parented. And then here is our group that contains the two IKs, and our second group for our second leg, which contains the two IKs. These are considered the root nodes. They are the node that sit on top of everything that's parented below. When you're creating a transform node for an existing rig, you simply select all of the items at that root level. So in this case, if we were to look here, it's really these three thick black handles here. With all three selected, and probably a good idea to be at the beginning of your animation. So I'm coming to frame 0, making sure. And we'll just come up to Edit Group. And if I hit the Shift now, right, we've got all of that together. We can still come in, our animation still works, but we can select this uppermost node, our new root of this particular chain, and we can scale. So you can see if I scale that down and press play, the animation is still there. If we were to rotate that new group node, let's say at 45 degrees of what he was doing, and press play, the animation just takes place from that new position. So I'll undo that. We'll leave that oriented straight. You probably want to, let's say, transform node, and we're ready to save. So we'll just close that out and we'll do a save as. We'll say File, Save Scene As, and rather than Robot Walk Cycle, let's say Robot Import. So we've got that saved away, and let's prepare the other two files. So there is Robot Import. Let's bring in our simple butterfly. And of course, if you have the intermediate or advanced, you can use these same techniques. Now in this case, I do have a couple of lights, so we'll delete that. And we're not going to use this particular curve. So make sure you're at frame 0. We'll create a new curve so that the insect interacts with the position of the robot. So we'll get rid of the curve. We're left with just this butterfly, the simple butterfly. If you had the intermediate or advanced, this would be the same. We just want to make sure we have a transform node at the top. And we can look with the grid and see that this is oriented straight up and down. It's sitting on the z-axis. Now we can take a look here. So there's the animation, and we'll just put this back to 0. So right at the origin, our robot might be in the same place starting there, but we can move that. So here's our path transform node for the butterfly. This is the simple butterfly, and now this one is ready for import. We'll say Save Scene As, and we'll call it butterfly import. And then finally, our natural element, we can use our tree. We'll start from our tree dynamic simply because that was a custom tree. It's always good to use custom items in your portfolio. And then we also had a custom bark and custom leaf. We didn't use the default from within Maya. And as just mentioned, it's good to have original textures. If you're using paint effects, it's good to have very customized paint effects in your portfolio. We'll leave the plane in this case. We can just use this plane for our subject. But we don't want the dynamics. Remember that this tree had the dynamic leaves and they fall. So let's get rid of all the dynamic items. You could leave those or you could regenerate in the scene, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to get rid of them. So there's the dynamic constraint. That's what had the leaves stick to the branches. Here are our two rigid solvers. We're going to keep the plane. There's the in cloth. Those leaves were converted to an in cloth. Then there's the nucleus. That's the whole physics engine. We'll get rid of that. And what are we left with? Oh, and that light. So we've got the plane. We've got the entire tree, which is just made up of the trunk and branches and the leaves themselves. And we have the original stroke. Now this relationship still exists. So if I wanted to come into the stroke and come over and make some changes, maybe for this one, since it's not going to be dynamic, it doesn't have to be this simple. Remember, we kept this tree simple so that the dynamics worked depending on the speed and strength of your processor. But we could come down to growth. Let's say we wanted to add an additional branch, right? We've got 3 here. You could type in 4. And right, we're doing that on the paint effect, but that paint effect is driving that output. This is a history relationship. So the polygonal conversion of the tree is still connected to the original paint effect. The original paint effect is hidden. It's still there. And you can make additions to that. Maybe we want a little bit more leaves, let's say 2 in a cluster. I can hit 2, and that fills out that tree a little bit more. Now, it looks black because my lights are on, but we can see that those are green. And there are some backside leaves, but those textures will render. Now, once we've done that, let's say this is the tree that we want, just to make things light, we will get rid of that history relationship. In fact, we can just select the original strokes and delete them. Now, of course, that's deleted the relationship because there's nothing there to have a relationship with. And just to be safe, let's come in and delete all of our history. So in this file all by itself, we had some dynamics, we had some relationships there. Let's just make sure that it's all gone. We'll say delete all by type history. So we just have this single tree in a single plane, and we'll save this one. Now, we could save this for import, or we could just do a save as and call this our scene, and then we can import those other 2 files. Whatever makes sense to you. I'm just going to save this, and I'll call this 57A final. So 57A final, that's what it's called, and we'll import the other 2 items. So I'll say file import, and we know we made robot import, and so we'll say there it is, and it's sitting in the same place, so we can figure this out right away. We'll just pick that transform node, and we can move it over. Now, your robot might be too big or too small, so you can make that larger or smaller. His size is alrighty, maybe a little bit larger, and maybe we'll move him out a little bit more. Make sure he doesn't run into those leaves. So here's our character. The other thing we can do is scale up this ground plane. So let's make this just 500. Make it nice and large, and we'll remember that if we're rendering through our perspective, we'll come down to our background color. That looks like something's loaded in here. Oh, no, it's just white. So we've got a white background already. Great, and just to review, so the minimum is just to have a biped walk cycle. The robot fulfills the hard surface modeling criteria for the course. Also fulfills the rigging a biped and then animating a walk cycle for a biped. Very simple, very straightforward, but for a first semester project, this is good. This is a good start to your animation career, if you will. So there we go. He walks and stops. Let's bring in the butterfly now. We'll say File, Import. We have butterfly for import. We'll import that. Too big, in the wrong place. So we can come to the Path Transform node and we'll scale. Now, the Path Transform is going to have its translate and rotate associated with the path. So we can go ahead and scale this here, let's say, without affecting that motion path. If if you wanted to, you could create an additional group here. You could scale the root. But let's just scale right on the path transform node. So we're not creating any new nodes at this point. Oops, I've got that selected. 0.2. Let's see if that is about the right size. Yeah. So and if you want to do something funny and have a really large insect, you could do that as well. So what is the action here? Comes down. Let's say we'll give ourselves 200 frames. So let's say we're creating a 200 frame animation. Character walks forward, and then we'll have that butterfly fly into the view of our robot. So he stops right here at 130, and this will be easier to generate in the top view. So I can see my robot here, and let's just create a path and have it fly around, and we'll have the robot track the butterfly. And the butterfly, it fulfills the course requirement for an organic shape. Both of them have textures. Both of them are rigged, but this is our the insect represents our organic modeling for the project. Now, for the semester. Now, the body on this simple is indeed simple. Ideally, you went on to that intermediate, and I know that some of you have even gone on to the advanced. That's great. This will fulfill the requirement for an organic shape. We'll come to Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool, and we'll draw this out, and let's have it go around. We can even have it go around twice, let's say, and then fly off that way. That's going to be a two-dimensional curve. We're hitting return when we're done, and we'll pull that up. I'm going to hide this ground plane. Let's just put it on a display layer and hide that away, make it a little bit easier to see. Now, this curve is two-dimensional. We probably want to write a butterfly is not going to fly perfectly level, so we can grab individual CVs, or we can use the soft select, right? Tap the B key to turn it on, hold down the B key, and scrub left, right, and we can maybe on the sides here it's flying up. And let's just do some individual, and this would force the robot to have to look up. And you can play around with that. We're just going to say that that's okay. Let's maybe have it come in lower. You can use your arrow keys on the keyboard to move through the vertexes if that's easier, or control vertices in this case. And that's flying around the robot. Okay, so we want this action to start, right? Maybe it is the butterfly itself that causes the robot to stop walking. And we said it stops at 130. So let's say we have this action begin at 120. We'll grab our path transform node, which is our butterfly. We'll shift select the path, and then in the rigging mode, we can come up to constrain motion paths attached to motion path. You've done this once or twice in the semester, but the more times you do it, the better off you'll be. We want this to start off at 120. Now we might have, and we said 200. So it's going to fly around from 120 to 200. If we need to adjust this, we can adjust the timing in the graph editor. It's on the Z-axis, and I don't remember, I seem to recall that I modeled this in the reverse direction, but let's see. We'll just hit attach, and yeah, that butterfly went on backwards. So let's just undo constrain motion path, attach to motion path. Right, your front axis is either going to be Z or X generally, or perhaps Y if you modeled in the wrong window. So we're going to say it's the Z-axis and inverse front, and I'll hit attach. And here it is out here. Now it's just static there, right? We've got that loop of it flying forever. And then it comes in, right, and flies around. Now, actually, let's have that start a little sooner. So how can we do that? With the path transform node selected, that's the group that contains the entire butterfly, we can come to the graph editor. This represents the entire course of the path. So it's 1 here, and that's, think more like 100%. So if I select this, this is 0% of the path at 120. This key is 1, or think of it like 100% at frame 200. So I said I wanted to start a little sooner. The other thing, we're not going to have it ease in, ease out, or accelerate, decelerate over the course of the path. So let's just make that linear. And as we said, I wanted this to take place a little bit sooner. I have the move tool selected. I've gone ahead and grabbed both of those. Shift key, middle mouse button, and I'm sliding it to the left. And we can just see, so as I mentioned, the interaction is maybe him seeing the butterfly and then stopping. So that makes a little more sense. He's walking along, and then a butterfly comes into his view, and he stops to watch it. All right, that makes sense. Now, we've got this butterfly out here just flying in place. You could position your camera so that it's out of view. That would be an option. But you can also just key the visibility. So we could come and, let's say we don't, where's our new start? We're starting at frame 93. So let's come to 93. And we could key the visibility. Again, you could position your camera so that you're not seeing it, and we certainly wouldn't want to have the camera in a position where we see the butterfly appear. So this has to happen out of view. So positioning your camera will be important when we go to render. But this is helpful just to know how you can have something hidden and then suddenly materialize. So let's say at frame 92, visibility is off. I'll select visibility, right click, and say key selected. And then at 93, we'll say that it's on. And we'll click visibility, right click, and say key selected. So now, right before that, and then it appears, you just want to make sure that your camera isn't seeing that. So if I were to turn on my resolution gate, I would just want to be at least that close to the character, right, so that it turns on and then comes in from out of view. Again, I'm going to turn that off, make it a little easier to see. And there we have it. Now the last thing we want to do is just animate the head. You could animate the entire upper bodies. It's always funny to make these robots turn 360, right, which is impossible for a real human or humanoid. So there it goes, comes in, and flies off. Now check your, I've got play every frame, so I'm going to go to 24 frames, which is standard. Give us a little bit better sense of the timing. Great. And final thing we'll do, well, not final thing, final animation we'll do. We need to add some lights to this before we can render. But let's come back to our robot and let's pick his neck. And we've got some existing animation here. Right, the character's head is moving ever so slightly. And we could just set keys directly. If you want to layer your animation, there are a number of ways to do that in Maya. A very simple way, with a rig like this, we could come and find the neck. Here's the neck joint, and we could just group it to itself. Put the pivot, right, use the D key to position the pivot at the same place as the neck joint. Then we have 2 transform nodes, and you could animate that on top. But for this, I think we'll just get rid of this key here on the neck joint, because we'll have him track the butterfly. So I'm going to right click that and delete it. And let's come to 120 and we'll delete it, right? Because when is it that he sees? And let's delete that one too. So walking along, and then he's naturally looking to the right. And so let's key him following that. So he sees something coming. And then now at 110, let's just have him look. We'll have to position, fine-tune this in the graph editor so it's not accelerating and decelerating. We'd probably use a spline tangent. And let's have him rotate around. We don't want our surfaces to penetrate. Maybe you limited your rotation, but I'm going to have him look up a little bit. And having a camera locked into position might be a good idea here so that we're seeing what the viewer will see. And let's turn that on. I'm going to zero that out just so that his head is flat and then rotate that around just on the Y. I don't want the corners of the geometry to penetrate the torso. So I hit that, and let's come around here. Now, because it is higher, I will rotate his head back a little bit. I'm going to zero that out again, because if I rotate, I'll have the back corner hit the torso and potentially penetrate it. Now, we could also do the lower body or the torso. So his head is up, not quite seeing it, so we can do a little bit of animation on the torso as well. And there it goes out. I'm going to just zero that again so that it's flat and then rotate that around. Let's see. Oh, well, I think... Well, that's actually funny. What I needed to do on my rotate Y, right? This is my rotate Y. Those all needed to be positive numbers. When I zeroed it out, yeah, let's just put this up here. If you wanted to delete those keys and do that again and not zero it out, that might be easier. Let's see what this looks like. So this is the rotate Y going round and around. I set those keys, and we could even maybe delete those in the middle. Let's see what this looks like. So he ends up in the wrong spot. So he comes, he's following, that works. And he's just a little bit late. Let's get him all the way around. Yeah, and there. And then we'll come and delete these intermediary ones. So let's see if that timing works. Yeah, that's kind of funny. And you could speed that up, right, if we wanted. So he kind of loses them here. It needs to be a little bit faster. So that would just mean pulling this up. And we like the flat tangent. His head should come to a stop. Let's see. Let's do this with it in view. So I've got that shift middle mouse button. That's where we want it. So oftentimes, right, I wanted to fine tune that rotation value. And so we just did it with him watching. So he's a little bit delayed. So let's move it to the left. So we adjusted the value by moving vertically, and now we'll pull it to the left just to have it sooner so that he tracks the butterfly. There we go. So there he's tracking it. And I actually, the head isn't penetrating. It is going up and down. Let's see, that's a little funny there. So that would be my rotate X. And for some reason, I'm just going to minimize that a little bit. Let's see. And we have our Z. We've got penetration there. Let's see. I'm actually going to get rid of those animation from here on out. So for my X and Z, I'm just going to delete those. And we'll leave it flat. And let's have the upward action on the waist. Right, so we can have him bend back a little bit. He's tracking there now as the butterfly is higher. Let's rotate that up a little bit. And then when he comes backwards, I'm not sure if this will look exactly right. So let's just try it. Yeah, and then he could come to zero position here. And I'll hide the joints. Yeah, that backwards and forward doesn't doesn't necessarily make sense at that speed. So just to get rid of it, I'll delete 120 forward. We'll come into the graph editor, and this was these rotates here. So we'll get rid of that. Okay, but that's the process of experimentation, right? We have to have the head follow. You could use a point constraint and have that constraint come off and on, but probably, or it is easier just in terms of complexity, just to animate it yourself. Okay, so just to review, and let's get rid of that curve in the view. And we'll hide our joints there, bring our plane. I'm gonna hide that just so that we can see, right? We've got this plane. I'm gonna move that just out of the way so we can see our main. We've got the tree mesh, the two pieces of the tree. We've got our entire robot. The three handles, the pelvis and the two IK groups have been grouped together. That allowed us to scale and reposition. We brought in our butterfly. Now it's hidden at this point in the animation, so that's why it's that darker gray. If we come down to when it's on, we'll see that there. And we just associated that transform node for the butterfly with this curve. We drew the curve at the end of the animation when the character's standing there. And if you wanted to have him try to grab it, you could have him reach up and key on the arm to try and catch that butterfly. That's been the motif of this little yellow robot and the butterflies, that the robot is trying to catch that. And you could create an entire little animated short with different scene vignettes of a robot trying to catch the insect. A little bit like the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. All right, let's position our camera and position some lights, and we'll render this out. So there's the action, character walks. Butterfly comes in, he watches it fly around and fly off the screen. In terms of lighting, as a generic default, if you think back to the beginning of the semester and we did the 3-point light, we just have a main light up at about 45 degrees over of the axis of the camera and the subject. 45 degrees up and over. That is just a standard generic starting point. I've created that light. It's sitting right where that tree is. I'll hit the T key, which allows me to handle the light separate. We'll turn lights on here and shadows on here. And that would be a position for that light, right? Having the shadow cast that way. And our main light here illuminating our subjects. And that is going to be dark. Let's come into the attribute editor, come to the directional light. We're just going to use depth map shadows. We don't have anything clear in the scene. We don't need super high quality shadows with a great fall off. If you wanted to experiment with ray trace shadows, if you turn on ray trace shadows, remember that you have to also, in the render settings, come and turn ray tracing on here. In fact, I'm going to turn that off since I'm not going to ray trace this scene. But if you did, that's where you would turn it on in the render settings. And to soften the shadows at the tail end, you increase these two numbers. And 4 and 40 are a good soft shadow. But again, this increases render time. I'm not going to use ray trace shadows. We're going to use depth map shadows. And I do want to increase the resolution. And if you want to soften the edge, you can increase the filter size. Now I'm going to leave this low just as I experiment here with overall intensities. And so there is our robot and a tree, some vegetation, and that's actually fine. So when you go to render it, you can crank that up and crank that filter size up. It's going to slow down your render time, but just as you're experimenting, you want to keep these low. So I'll keep them low for now until we're done. And I oftentimes recommend an ambient. Now, when you render, it's going to render in the raw. So we want to come and look at it in RAW, and you can see the necessity for the ambient and bumping up the intensity of the directional. Now, if you, as soon as you close this and re-render it, it's going to do the color correction. So let's set it to render raw every time. We can come to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and then in the color management, turn off the enable color management. Rendering raw is pretty standard in a professional production because you can take the raw and it gives you greater flexibility to affect the color and tonality in a program like Premiere or After Effects. So it gives you greater flexibility to render in the raw. And now if we render, it won't switch back to sRGB, it will just be in the raw. Let's crank up that directional to 2. And that gets us back to about where we were. You see there's much better color saturation, but easy to bring down. If you don't like that amount, you can bring it down or leave it so the raw is giving you just the full saturation of color. And then let's add just a fill. Remember, we want shadows, but we don't want black shadows necessarily. Just create an ambient. Now the 1 would be way too much. I'll put that down to about 0.2. We'll render this, and that looks fine. That will do. We see some shadow walking along. Now this is the simple version. If you created, if you did the environmental exercises, whether for day or night, you'll have a ground plane. Maybe you've created some grass. You've got some mountains, some additional trees on the cards. Maybe you created a sky plane. You can use all of that. But if you are just doing the minimum, and this is a full credit minimum, so when I say minimum, I don't mean 70%, I mean 100%. You can get 100% credit for your final for just executing this real simple version. But if it's going into your portfolio, if you're going to be showcasing the work, then you really do want to take the time to build out a more involved environment. This is just basic white. Now, you can use these types of renders, really, maybe you're passing this off to the environmental artist who is going to create all of that. And you just want to show that environmental animator, right? You've got these 3 elements, the tree, the biped, and the insect. And then you can pass that off or handle that later as a separate environment, maintaining all of this, and even compositing. So you could render this out on Alpha Channel, and then experiment with different environments. That is an option as well. Okay, and then let's just look at how our camera position is. So this is, let's also get our standard. We're going to talk about rendering options in just a moment, but I'm going to come to our 960 by 540, which is the standard ratio for film and television, or at least high definition television. This is the standard ratio. Film is a little bit wider, but this is the standard that you'll see. Now we're just evaluating. Yeah, so here is where our main action is. Let's see if we can just get a nice position there, as close as we can. I want to keep that whole tree in the view. So that's good. We've got everything in the view. Sees that. Maybe you animate him grabbing it. Maybe you animate him taking a few more steps. Maybe you rotate and have him chase after. We don't talk about, let's see, sorry. Redirect. If we wanted him to, we could copy and paste that walk cycle and put it here, right where we might imagine him taking off after the butterfly, right? You could paste that exact walk cycle and then have him come at maybe 45 degrees from that. And that is with the redirect. We talk about this in the second semester as we're creating more involved projects. But you could do a search for that, the help on the My Help. It's not a complicated tool. and you could copy and paste that walk cycle, redirect him, and have him follow after the butterfly. But again, this lesson, this particular video that you're watching right now is just the bare minimum. We have a natural environment tree, we have a bipedal hard surface character, the robot, we have a organic soft surface, which is the insect, and they're interacting, and the interaction is simply the robot watching the butterfly. You can create much more sophisticated interactions, but just for full credit, the minimum that you need to do would be a simple interaction, which is having the robot watch. Okay, render options. If you have downloaded Premiere or After Effects, or you have some other video editing application, then render it at full 1080. So this would be HD 1080. That gives you 1920 by 1080. And you notice that the ratio didn't change. It's just the overall size. And just quick review, you'd want to call this, right? You want to see where it's rendering to. I've got my default set here, name.number.extension. Yeah, we're doing, let's just start at 0 to 200. It's our perspective camera. If you created an additional camera, you would want to make sure that you selected it there. And again, if you've got Premiere, After Effects, or some other application, you can render at 1920 by 1080. If you haven't downloaded those other applications and you're not going to be able to by the end of the semester, render at 960 by 540, the HD 540. Again, it's the same ratio, it's just smaller. And you can use EasyGIF.com, the EasyGIF creator online application, and just create a 200 frame animated GIF at 960 by 540. But I'm going to render this out full screen, and we'll jump into Premiere for those of you who have downloaded it. At this, we would want production, and I'm not ray tracing. If you chose to do ray tracing shadows, you have the time to experiment, and you're going to be experimenting. Right, make sure you understand if this is on or off. I'm leaving it off. We're just doing basic depth map shadows. One shadow on the directional light, and I'll come back and yeah, we'll just crank that up, and I would put this to 5. Right, so I'm all ready. I'm not going to make any changes. I'm going to set it to render. I'm going to go do something else, come back when it's done. So we'll crank up the resolution, crank up the filter size on my directional light, and we're ready to go. And we'll say rendering, render, batch render. And we'll come back after that renders and we'll load it into Premiere. If you're not using Premiere, just use the GIF Maker application that we've been using throughout the semester, and that will be fine. But I know many of you want to, you've got beautiful environments and you really want to render it out high def and do a full screen version in Premiere or After Effects. Okay, let's render this, and we'll be back in a second.